Good evening. I'm Dr. Troy Fullerton, and this is going to be a talk tonight on grammar. Now, in the language acquisition community, and yes, I use that word very carefully, in the language acquisition community, grammar has become somewhat of a naughty word almost. People who learn languages are said to have gone about it the wrong way. We're all supposed to simply acquire languages naturally, and we're supposed to acquire them through comprehensible input. I want to get into this tonight and talk about it a little bit. You'll see all over the internet all kinds of programs out there. It really even predates the internet. You see all of these methods that proclaim that you don't need grammar. If you took a foreign language class, you didn't go there to learn to conjugate a verb. You hear people say that you can learn naturally. The natural approach, all you have to do is get comprehensible input. That is, you have to be surrounded by language that you can understand, and the theory goes, or I should say the hypothesis goes, that if you have enough of this input that is comprehensible, that is, you can figure out through the context or through what you already know or whatever, you can figure out what it means. If it's just a little bit beyond your level, you will be learning. And so many new approaches feature this, and it's become quite a tug of war in a lot of foreign language classrooms, because you'll have people there who, with practically quasi-religious fervor, back this idea that teachers should not correct grammatical errors, should not teach grammar, that all you got to do is just talk and provide large amounts, copious amounts of comprehensible input, and this learning will take place. Now, this appeals to so much of the crowd that wants to get away from any grunt work in language learning. It's sort of like a fad approach, sort of like a get-rich-quick scheme, that I can have it all without working for it. If I just get surrounded by this comprehensible input and I have enough exposure to it, I'm going to learn to understand first, and then I'm going to eventually start to produce, and this is going to eventually lead to me being a fluent speaker of the language, and it will be grammatically correct, much like children. When children learn their first language, they are able to produce it. It sounds right, it's grammatically correct, but they never studied the grammar. It's attractive to teachers who want to make their classes just talk, have fun using the language. And what's worse about it than anything is this comes with an implicit accusation that anything other than comprehensible input is a waste of time. It bores the students, and it's probably detrimental to their language acquisition. Now, I want to try to make a little sense out of this, and what I'm about to say may surprise you. I am not opposed to comprehensible input. I'm not opposed to the different methodologies that feature it. What I am opposed to is the over-reliance on it, and I want to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But first of all, let's try to understand what this whole thing is based on. This idea, this notion, is based on Stephen Krashen's input hypotheses. He's got a list of, at least 4 hypotheses, and there's probably some more that could go along with this that we could add to the list. But the whole idea between Stephen Krashen's input hypotheses are that we acquire language in a natural order, and that there's nothing we can do to upset that order. Studies have shown that people will acquire different elements of grammar in a natural way, in a predictable way, and there's nothing that we can do to change that. We can go and study the grammar of a language, but when it comes time to actually produce the language, especially in an impromptu setting, then we may not actually produce it in a grammatically correct way unless we've gone through this healthy developmental stage and actually gotten there. So supposedly, languages should be acquired grammatically, much like children acquire them. And this is, again, going to result in this accurate fluency without ever having studied the language. Now, that's one part of it. The other part of it is that we acquire these languages simply through having large amounts of this comprehensible input. And once again, like I said, comprehensible means we can make sense out of it. We can understand it. And supposedly, the practitioner, the teacher, is going to give us comprehensible input that is just slightly beyond where we're currently at, and that is going to result in language acquisition taking place. Now, let me state some things up front here. I respect Dr. Krashen's hypotheses. I think there's a lot of evidence to support them. We have to realize that this is not settled science. The jury is still out on some of this, and there is some evidence that goes one way or the other on this issue. There is abundant evidence out there, and studies show this, that show that when an individual acquires a language, in order to get it to a native level, there's going to have to be some explicit grammatical study done. Sorry, that's just the way it goes. But I want to go back even before that. I want to go back to some of the more traditional classical approaches to studying languages. Why are we denying that these approaches have worked with a lot of people? Why are we denying that a lot of people learned, and I'm using that word intentionally, another language without having all of these copious amounts of comprehensible input and nothing else? Why are we denying that? Because it is true. It is true. So let's just go ahead and examine this a little bit. First of all, there is this dubious distinction that Dr. Krashen puts forward between language acquisition and language learning. When I started this program tonight, I said I used the expression language acquisition deliberately. Well, that's why. Because supposedly languages are not learned, they're acquired. Supposedly we're going to grasp the language as it's used from comprehensible input, and that's actually the way that language skills are developed. Whatever we learn explicitly through study, through our own efforts, supposedly that's not going to translate into an ability to actually use language. That distinction is dubious at best. I can clearly see that grammar is not enough, and people are going to have to get comprehensible input in order to develop fluency. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever, but there is simply no good evidence that shows that grammatically correct fluency is going to happen automatically just from listening alone. Now, this is something that I brought up prior to acquiring my PhD. I brought this up in language acquisition circles. I almost feel like I shouldn't say language learning circles, but let's say language instruction circles. I would bring up a few things that I had seen. For years, I have known a lot of immigrants, Latino immigrants, who've come to the United States and learned English as a second language. I know some of them who understand everything they hear and never learn to produce English in a grammatical way with a decent accent. They cannot speak grammatically correct English, even though they've had enough comprehensible input that they can understand everything and have lived here for years. When I brought this up in the language instruction community, some people treated it like it was just too stupid of a question to even contemplate. It was beneath their notice. Well, it's not. It's a very valid point. what happened there. Now, those who are very much aligned with Dr. Krashen would tell you, well, this is probably because of the effective filter. That is, people had a negative feeling about the English-speaking community, about America. Maybe they had a lot of insecurity about their own language use, and so for whatever reason, they were nervous, anxious, afraid, turned off, negatively affected. Therefore, they had this emotional filter that kept the comprehensible input from landing on its target and producing fluent speech. I have a problem with that. I have never seen any evidence that people that I have known who are like this had any real problem with the American English-speaking community. I'm not saying nothing has ever happened, but I'm just saying I've never seen that to be an issue. Furthermore, I've known people in this situation who are well educated and people who are already able to learn, people who are already able to learn new things and feel comfortable about what they were learning. I just don't buy it that the effective filter can explain all of that away. And another thing, well, let me park on that for just a minute. How many of you have known Chinese immigrants or Vietnamese immigrants? People who have come over here, their accent is oftentimes even worse than that of Latinos who learn English as a second language because their language, being an Oriental language and not one of the Romance languages, not one of the Germanic languages, the grammar, everything is so different than English that they never do quite get across that hump to try to, acquire English. Or I won't say they haven't tried. They never have gotten across the hump to actually grasp English grammatically. Certainly, their accent doesn't show it. But what's going on there that they never were able to, despite the fact that, once again, they understand what they hear. They interact with the community. They're not having any problem at all. So this is a very serious question mark that I have. Another thing is, how do we explain fossilized errors? That is, where people have learned to say something incorrectly, and they've become quite fluent in their incorrect speech, and they continue that way for years, despite the fact that they're surrounded by correct speech. I've seen that happen with students who were whose language instruction was largely comprehensible input as well. I've seen them acquire these bad speech habits, never quite get over them. They can say it wrong, but they're fluent in the way they say it wrong. And this can go on for years if it's not actually addressed through explicit study. So, and the other thing is, one other thing is, what evidence is there that you can actually learn grammar and vocabulary explicitly and then practice it to the point of fluency and automaticity? Finally, a problem that I have with the whole natural approach and with this whole philosophy is that it ignores the fact that people acquire an interlanguage. It ignores the fact that when people learn a language, when they learn a language later in life, they are going to filter that new language through the lens of their own language, regardless of how much we try to set it up to where they do not have any access to their native language as they're learning a new one. I have known people that, I've known people that would just totally get bent out of shape if a language teacher had English on their test when they were giving tests to students, because there's something magical supposedly about having everything all in Spanish, or if they used English in the classroom. What's the matter with using English in a Spanish classroom or in any other foreign language classroom if we can use English to bridge over, to access, to understand the structures, understand another language, if we can explain it in short order and then simply give it to people? How is that short-circuiting the language acquisition process. It's not. It's not. That's foolish. That's foolish. People will use an interlanguage. They will filter it through the lens of their own language first. And when they find out that that does not work, they can make adjustments as they go, but they're going to do it whether we want them to or not. So another thing I'm looking at is, where is the evidence that comprehensible input actually works in terms of producing bilingual people? I started learning Spanish when I was in high school. I use Spanish all the time. I'm an interpreter. I use it frequently. Where are all of these other people that just got large amounts of comprehensible input? What I have seen is that when comprehensible input is not anchored with some actual grammatical study, what happens is any language acquisition that takes place evaporates. Even when it sticks, however, it's often ungrammatical. So what I am trying to put forth is that comprehensible input is fine. I don't have a problem with it. But why the false dichotomy? What's the point of avoiding grammar? What's the point of avoiding one's native language? There is no point in it. That is the waste of time. Trying to avoid anything other than just simply comprehensible input and more input, that's going to take longer, and it's not going to produce the results that we want. Grammar is a part of the language. Now, one of the reasons I believe why this has become such an issue is because oftentimes students come to us in school with a very weak set of grammar skills in the first place. Their knowledge of English grammar is often very weak, pathetically scanty when they're in high school. And I understand that when you get up and start talking about abstractions such as grammar, when you don't have any context to it. I mean, yes, it does depend on how you teach it, but oftentimes kids, their eyes can glaze over and it can seem like it's boring and pointless. However, many people will tell you that the reason they did not understand English grammar, well, in the first place, they tried to teach these abstractions when the kids were way too young. They couldn't grasp them. But when they had something else to compare it to, such as learning a foreign language, when they had something else to compare it to, it started to make sense. That is the case many times. If we try to avoid teaching grammar in a foreign language in our foreign language classes, we're short-circuiting that process. Oftentimes, the light bulb will go off. I'm going to give you an example. When I was a freshman in high school, I was typical of a lot of freshmen in high school, freshman boy in high school. I was sitting in the back of the classroom, clear over in the corner, and I remember my freshman English grammar teacher trying to teach us about the subject pronouns. And he said, a pronoun is a word that replaces a noun. That's the only thing I got out of the long, laborious lecture. I'll never forget this. It was like, you know, and you're trying to stay awake while they go through and teach you all of this. But the thing I got out of it was a pronoun is a word that replaces a noun in a sentence. All right, so then the exercise was we were supposed to take sentences and replace the subject with a pronoun. So, for example, I don't remember the exact example, but for example, if a sentence said, Mr. Smith drives the car, we're supposed to rewrite that sentence and replace Mr. Smith with a pronoun. Well, I, in all of my sagely freshman logic, wrote on my paper, the guy drives the car. Now, don't you have to give me credit for my logic there? The guy, that replaces Mr. Smith, right? It wasn't until I got to Spanish class where the Spanish teacher was telling us, yo, nosotros, I and we, tú, singular familiar you, él, ella, usted, he, she, singular formal you, ellos, ellas, they, ustedes, all of you, The light bulb went off when I was like, oh, I get it. It's just a short little list of a few different words. Those are the subject pronouns. Now I understand. I had something to compare it to. And then it made sense. But I am digressing a little bit. I do think a lot of times that we try to teach kids grammar way too soon, and they can't handle those abstractions. But the other thing is, a lot of times words in English will change parts of speech on us. So we can say, for example, that the word school is a noun. Well, it is. But in English, I can talk about a school bus. Well, now that word is being used as an adjective. Or I can say, we are going to school our children in mathematics. Well, now I'm using it as a verb. And so that's very hard oftentimes for people to grapple with. I think that people oftentimes at an early age just throw their hands up and give up. A good language teacher, a good foreign language teacher, can overcome all of that, can give meaty, substantive lessons to try to explain all of that. And yes, there is a point to it, because it makes the language acquisition process faster. Once they can really grasp what a subject is, what an object is, what an indirect object is, what a past participle is, all of these different points, once they can understand that, then we can explain it to them in their foreign language, their target language, I should say, the language they're trying to learn. And it's like, it makes total sense, and it didn't take 50 dozen repetitions on 50 dozen different days from 50 dozen different sources for something to finally kind of halfway start to make sense. So there is a reason for it. So grammar, all it is just a way to organize the parts of a sentence in a way that fits with its function, and it can help us, studying grammar can help us to make sense out of how those parts fit together. So once again, this can speed up making sense out of a new system. And isn't that what we want to do? Is we want to, in an expeditious manner, acquire a new language. And like I said earlier, what's the matter with learning grammar and vocabulary than practicing it to the point of automaticity and fluency? Practicing, having some spaced repetition activities to learn the vocabulary, getting in and having a good context to use it in, but then actually using it. So personally, I'm tired of the false dichotomy. I'm tired of people in the language instruction community implying that if you're not doing comprehensible input almost exclusively, then all you're doing is slogging your way through a boring grammar book. There is no false dichotomy. You can teach grammar explicitly and still do all of these other wonderful things. Have TPRS stories and do comprehensible input and do readings and fluency practice and ask questions and have people develop automaticity. All of these other things do not exclude explicitly studying grammar, and why should it? So no, it's not either grammar or comprehensible input. You need both. So once again, I've known people who took this to an almost religious level, that if you say anything contrary to what they're saying, it's almost some form of blasphemy or something. I don't accept that. I don't accept that. I think that is definitely a false dichotomy, and I'm for balance and for some common sense. Perhaps you are too.